So yeah, today we're going to talk a little bit about CSS in Reason and OCaml. Um, so for the ones that you don't know me, I'm David Sancho. I'm from Barcelona, and I work as a remote software developer for Rapid. You should check it out. It's actually really cool. So I created Stylet PBX, and I'm a amateur runner cyclist. So if you're interested with that, please talk to me. That's like I love the sport, so cool. So let's jump in. So I started Reason less than 1 year ago. I think Javi, like one of my friends here in Barcelona, presented to me to that, and I was very dissatisfied with how you would style a Reason React app. Um, but mostly because I love CSS. I'm like this kind of like front end guy who loves CSS. I'm not like only doing markup these days, so I do like full spectrum of front end. But I do appreciate that all the CSS features like it is by the browsers, and I know that it's like very complex and hidden language and a lot of tweaks, but I love to play around those and understand those, even they are might be complex. So yeah, so when I came to Reason, there's very like a lot of good things about Reason. I'm just gonna try to specify one that I felt that was very true, like kind of a value, and that Reason tries to like bring all your knowledge that you have to write front end and apply it to like a bare system kind of thing. So it would inherit all the React knowledge. You inherit like all the immutability that you might come from the JavaScript. I'm talking just like for the JavaScript kind of people. And then it's set up on top of OCaml. And I think I'm trying to, what I try to explain today is what I would achieve or try to achieve with this library. So yeah, so usually how do I style my apps or how my team or the teams I work in the past, it's we want to create a minimum components that can be reusable. You can call it design system, tokens, components, bootstrap, whatever. And I try to make it as easy for anyone that is a designer or even a product manager to create UI, right? Like they can play around, be composable, and never let them write CSS in as maximum as possible or putting that at the edge. So this is how I would, I love to reach that point of maturity of the front end. So that was a little bit of context. When you write to Reason, there's like two ways of doing that, right? So you have like utility-based class CSS frameworks that they are not new, but it has been a trend lately with Tailwind. And the other ones are like type CSS as a set of functions. And I tried to put the title out of them, but we can walk later to understanding them better. So this is the two options that most people recommend. So let's walk to when I start, I look at them very closely. So first is Tailwind. Tailwind is amazing. Like I don't want to like say anything bad about them. But I think the solution is pretty nice. Like you set up a config, you do minimal configuration, and then it auto generates these CSS classes for you. So it's atomic. You use these shorthand class names to apply. All of them are like thought about like you would not break the design kind of thing. So you would be always in sync with your previous CSS. There's a few benefits. So like the output of it's a CSS file. So you can run purge CSS or you could, I don't know, cache it. And there's many benefits on outputting, like bundling a CSS file at the end. And it's really easy for not the designer kind of person. So the person who hates CSS finds a Tailwind very easy. You can fall in love with Tailwind because of that. Let's talk about like not the parts that I'm super familiar with or like it. So the first one is that it's a little bit noisy. So that's the example that I wrote example on Tailwinds with Reason React. So you could see that I'm not pretty sure what's going on this page, like on this component. You could make it less noisy, like abstracting components and doing like the kind of regular thing that you do in your code base. but when you jump into here, like in the document, you don't really know exactly what's going on. The other problem is naming, right? I see that the MD-2 is margin top, blah, blah, blah. But I found myself all the time, instead of going to the documentation, going to the generated file and look for, okay, how was letter spacing? Or how was justify consent? Wow. So I got a problem with naming. It's my particular problem because I know CSS very well, or not very well, but I know enough to talk CSS. So this was a barrier for me. The other one is reusability. Here in this example as well, I could reuse the link component, so the finding customers. Sorry. So I could reuse the link component, but I could replace some class names. It's really hard to know which class names exist, don't exist, are duplicated. Do they override each other? So the reusability is not very great. One of my colleagues created a PBX to validate the strings of the tailwind. So I know that there's issues with reusability as well. And that's another one, like for me as well, like it's hard to build the system. So these small pieces that tie together, I think that will let you to create like more kind of freedom into the space. So I found it like as a negative thing. But yeah, let's talk about like the other side. So typed CSS to the functions. So this is how, like, let's say the reason kind of way. So you have type safety. So no more runtime and applying styles. I think it's not as famous as the type error often defined, but the height and the thin pixels, I think I saw it very often with, I don't know, any solution in JavaScript. You get the reasonable APIs. So we'll talk about this in a minute, but you would see that all the declaration of CSS apply one-to-one to the APIs that tries to reach. So you get the nice API, so you could autocomplete. There's many benefits of that. And of course, like since it's type safe, you will not break that. It inherits all the benefits from CSS in JavaScript. So with reusable, it's composable, blah, blah, blah. And then you have full control over styling, which is like a very good thing. So this is more or less how most of you write CSS these days. So I really like that. I just find it like a little bit picky. So generally picky. I find it like a little bit like it can be improved. This is I think BS emotion example. So yeah. And yeah, you apply it on the class name. So you might more or less could see what's going on. So I know that's a card and title and a button just looking at the JSX. I think that's a pure powerful feature. So let me explain a little bit how the more or less the people who wrote the bindings or they thought about this. So every line is a declaration. At least I'm going to more or less describe the AST of CSS, but just to speak the same language. So every line is a declaration. Every item is a property, and every value is a value, right? So every value that has a unit, it's a dimension. So every dimension has a value and a unit applied. So how they thought about that is that every property tends to be a function. Every value is neither a variant or a constant. And then every value is a function as well. In every unit is a regular primitive like integer or float, which with this technique or this strategy kind of thing, you would do all sorts of CSS properties out of the way. You would have a lot of problems, and we're going to talk about it in a minute as well, but this is like more like the same as Elm CSS does it, and I think Clojure kind of do similar APIs. So yeah, that's more or less the idea behind these bindings or implementation of CSS or wrapping CSS, whatever you want to call it. I don't have a specific name. So, but there's one tiny problem. Like CSS is very complex. Like there's a lot of properties that can be shorthanded and have a lot of values or even a lot of declarations in the same shorthand. And so this is box shadow. This is grid. This is, I don't know, like this is text shadow, sorry. This is background repeat. All of these properties, you found it very weird when you are trying to write it in VS Emotion, for instance. I know that this, like the declaration of CSS matches perfectly with the VS kind of, well, the VS Emotion declaration. But as soon as we get into more complex CSS, which we, I think, all do, or we, well, at least when you're creating like a UI that is really complex, you end up doing. And you see that at the end, I really couldn't make the translation of different backgrounds. With the background relation, I think it's pretty amazing. So having like a position, size, cover, and two, yeah, was impossible. And if you see how many parentheses are here, yeah, you could end up having the declaration on the Chrome DevTools working perfectly, but trying to fit it in the Reason code base could be a nightmare. And I think if you see like all of these repos, most of issues are related to this problem. Like people who know CSS or are doing something that they already know that it works, but they cannot translate into the actual APIs. I think that's a huge problem. Aside from that, I got the idea that both solutions lack something that I expected when I joined into Reason. That it's first-class support for React components. Since React is built in Reason, it's actually built in PocketScript as well because the PBX, but it's built in Reason. I thought that the CSS would be like as well first-class support for React components. I thought that, I assumed that, right? It was not the case. So what I wanted, just like as a wish list, I want the imperative type safety. I want to still do Reason and be safe. I want to carry all my CSS knowledge, so I don't want to lose my knowledge. Not because I'm like I want to keep what I'm having. It's mostly like my developer experience is about like when I'm migrating a component from JavaScript to Reason. If I used Stylet components, emotion, blah blah blah, or even CSS modules, I could just map it, like do a migration manually, or even like a code mode, and run it from all my code base and be sure that the thing works. My own maintainability. I think that these CSS as functions turns to be not very maintainable, or like not has a huge learning curve. I don't know. The other one is like first-class support, as I mentioned, and easier to create dynamic components. What I mean with dynamic components is like a component that the styles can have holes. So you could think about like a spacer component that now is famous on Twitter, having a component with a spacer. So you would pass a unit, and you could pass a value, and you apply the margin for you. And this I would call it from now on dynamic components. And the last wish is to excellent editor support. So I think once you get autocomplete and you could get like a whole reload in your editor, you feel like you're doing CSS or any sort of development on the DevTools instead of your editor, which is I think the goal for every person that works on developer experience, or at least in this kind of human machine interface. So all of this is not new. Like I didn't guess it out of the blue. It's based on more solutions that I saw in CSS and JS around the last years. I think Max Stoiber, I don't know how to pronounce the name, but explained the story. I think was on a React meetup. So he explained the story about like all the CSS in JS story was kind of amazing, but I think he lacks the type safety. So yeah. So the benefits, I could do the list like super long of this, but I'm gonna share like 3-4 things. So collocating your styles with your components, I think it's powerful. You refactor, you remove, and then you remove it on the same file. you don't need to separate two different files. I think that's powerful. I think all the libraries that I mentioned have it as well. Sharing constant with JavaScript, I think having the separation of concerns between CSS and JavaScript, it's correct on most of cases. But when you're doing components, that's not the case. These styles are very tied to your JavaScript implementation. And not worry about CSS specificity. I think that's our worst nightmare when you're working on a huge code base. But Stylet components and motion both have the same API, which I'm gonna try to mimic during this presentation. So for the ones that you don't know it, or maybe like you don't see it in live, so that's JavaScript. Stylet is the function that returns a React component. And they use this string literals syntax that was recently new on the JavaScript wall. And you can use these as components. You define CSS inline as you would do in a CSS file. One extra thing is that they're not only like CSS declarations, they are spreadsheets, meaning that they parse nested rows. So if you inline a media query, or you inline the overstate, or you inline keyframe, I think all of this works out of the blue, which makes you like all your knowledge that you did 4 years ago, probably with SAS or less, you would have it here. And I think that's another powerful feature. The thing that I'm most fan of is that from this UI that I haven't left, I can see the JSX, and I don't need to open the browser to understand how the UI looks like. I think that's a powerful feature that it's not it's not really mentioned in React, or at least on CSS in JavaScript. So I can see that all the components matches one-to-one to my render method. So if I move the sidebar upper, I know that it's going to be on top of the header, right? So I can predict very well the UI without having the feedback loop of opening the editor. So that's very cool. So my solution, I created a PBX, right? It's called Stylet PBX, and tries to mimic the Stylet components API. I'm gonna try to dive in a little bit with what's a PBX. We're not gonna get very deep, it's just like an overview, just in case that you don't know it. So a PBX, it's a preprocessor extension. So it's a feature of the OCaml compiler that are called extension points that transform your code into other shader code without getting into much detail. So the idea of a PBX is a function that takes AST and outputs AST. So AST is abstract syntax tree. So it's a representation out of your code in a data structures that the compiler understands, and any tool that you build as a PBX or a PBX needs to understand, right? So you can think it about if the compilation process goes from left to right, you have your source code, Reason or OCaml or whatever, and then the compiler parses it for you, so transforms your tokens, like the string of the code into, or the buffer into ASTs. So these are in actual Reason, they are just records and complex nested recursive. You could play around in AST Explorer. Then the processor gets the AST and passes through all your PBXs in a certain order. And then after that, it runs the type safety, right? So it's a very simplified way. There are processes and there's like turning backs and stuff that I almost don't understand. But yeah, that's a simplified view of what a PBX is. Cool. Let's run a simple example. This is fake. Like, I mean, I made up just for this presentation, but it would be cool to have this PBX. So imagine that you want to represent mathematical operations in OCaml, right? And you would not want to make it verbose. You want to have it like as a mathematical expression. What PBXs are born? The idea is you could expand the compiler syntax. So you could make a simplification out of your syntax, and then do the compiler extend your syntax for you. Let me try to explain with an example. So our PBX that we made up now, it gets your payload, that's the string that you see on screen, and it transforms it into multiplication operation, right? So it transforms the P into matplotlib and the quadratic into a quadratic operation, the multiplication. So that's the biggest idea of PBXs. A few examples are GraphQL, so the same idea. GraphQL has a specific syntax that gets transformed into a big JSON blob. If you need to write the JSON blob by yourself, that would be unmanageable. So the guys on GraphQL PBX, they did an amazing job. And I think on JavaScript side, they do it as well, right? So they have the GraphQL macro. So they transform on build time the syntax. Well, I said build time, maybe not, but yeah. So the PBX on the reason side, it's build time. So you transform this index into a more complex index. I think the OCaml people, at least what they wrote, I'm not pretty sure, but they allowed that because many people wanted to add features on the compiler. And I think the compiler has its own roadmap, so they kind of give you a way to extend the syntax in your use case rather than implementing V, right? That maybe not everybody wants it, and we'll get into the way. I'm not sure about this, just my guess. So let's jump into how it works. My Stylet PBX. So you see in the left the API. So the first thing that we do is we parse the CSS to an AST that it's a CSS representation. So as I mentioned, every line is a declaration, which gets transformed into a kind of AST, right? So that you can see the AST of this declaration. That's a list, and then you have declaration display flex, and we have a value, and identifier, and then it's flex. So you see the one-to-one translation, kind of the same idea that the people that wrap the CSS in Reason did, but you leave it into the compiler, right? You leave this transformation that is kind of like a machine responsibility, or at least for me, is a machine responsibility. You leave it to the PBX. And then we get this CSS AST, and we transform to VS Emotion API. So my PBX is built on top of VS Emotion under the hood. Right now, you need to have both dependencies. We're gonna talk about later, but yeah, that's the main idea. And then we get the AST and we transform into the one-to-one representation that I explained before. So you get your styles. The last one is generate the React component boilerplate, let's call it. So you get your styles from one side, and then you need to create the model, make props, like the make function. So that's more or less what everything is to happen to have your React component in your render method. So what, the purpose of it was to bring the best, or try to bring the best of two worlds. So one is developer experience. As I mentioned, my experience is to prototype something on the browser, get the CSS and put it back on your file, or even migrating one from one code base to another one with type safety. So that's one goal that I've tried to achieve. And the other one is maintainability. I do want to have all my dynamic styles and styling very easy to change. Cool. So let me walk through a little bit fast about the features that I got it working so far. So the first one, well, I jumped to the second one, sorry. So the first one is the CSS function. So many people want to have one line CSS for the class name and write down those styles in CSS rather than these APIs that I mentioned before. So I transformed the CSS into emotion calls. Another one is styles global. So you would want to do, normalize or load fonts or any sort of time. That's like a side effect that happens on the first time that you run the app, on the top page that you run the app. The other one is nested selectors. It's currently on beta because we will see it very soon. But the idea is the same. You would have these semantics that you used to have in SAS. Right now you cannot, but it's on the roadmap to reference other components. So you could over and then change another property of another component. So that's very powerful. The other one is interpolate variables. I think that's a must. for any sort of design, front-end design that you're front-end code that you're trying to do, because you will always have like a kind of like a constant object, constant files or tokens that you would need to share across your app, and you would want to interpolate and reuse these tokens. The other one is dynamic components that I mentioned before. So by props, you could dynamically create those styles for your component. It's on beta because we only accept strings. We'll talk a little bit later, but the idea is that we don't have full support for all the primitives for Reason yet. And the latest one is CSS support. So since I'm mapping this CSS to BS Emotion, there's so much work to do, and so I left all the complex ones for like at the end, and those are like the ones that I mentioned before. Cool. So I want to explain a little bit what's next. If you're curious, there's like, I try to keep it very good organized on the project GitHub, but I'm going to like to speech what's next for Stylet PBX. So the first one is very easy. It's finish CSS support. I think every app would need any sort of style like this. The other one is create a stable dynamic styles API. If you have any input about how to create dynamic data, but just the primitive inside strings in OCaml or Reason, I'm all ears. I created a little prototype and it kind of works, but I don't have like full experience on that. So that's the ideal API for it. So it's still ongoing. The idea that I came about is like you would need to specify the type on your function definition, and we would know that the pixels function expects an integer, or expects a CSS unit. So we're going to do the casting for you from integer to CSS unit. But instead of integer, you want to pass a string, would know that it's a string, and then do the from string to integer to CSS unit. So that's currently only works for strings because we didn't make this kind of a smart typing way. And the other one that I wanted to do is pattern match. So pattern match on anything really, but the key feature would be to on variants or polyvariants, where you could specify like a button and then the three kinds, or nested pattern matching. And that would be like at least what I thought would be a nice API, but I'm not sure. I'm open to feedback for this. Cool. The other one, so since one of the problems of PBX that I didn't mention is editor support, right? I said like all the bad things about Darwin and all the bad things about the other one, but I didn't say the bad things about mine. So this is the bad thing for now. So our editor support, right? The syntax that you saw is like on the Google, like on the Google slides. It's not perfect, but you would, if you would do it in JavaScript and style components, you would have like syntax highlight and autocomplete for your CSS properties. I think that's like the North Star, and it might not be very hard to implement nowadays, but I didn't spend the time on creating the editors. The other one is the theme API. So I want to get all the goodies from Tailwind. So creating, it's just a simplified version. So you would create a config and you have the theme provider. And then inside your component, you would have access to all the generated styles from your app. This would be records. So it would be type safe. I would use some sort of React context. I have a proof of concept out of this, that doesn't fully work, but because like I'm more worried about like the config kind of side on this approach. I think the theme and the context it gets good. And the last one, which is the greatest one, I guess, but it's zero runtime costs. And we saw on the JavaScript wall Linaria that does zero runtime costs on your CSS, which means all the static ones are very easy. Like once you render the first time the component, it gets attached to the head of your page. That it has like a minimum runtime, but once you render, you don't have any problem. when you have the dynamic components, that gets where the thing gets a little bit trickier, because every time you render a component, these style sheets needs to update. There's emotion solve it in a way, and style component solve it in another way. I really like what Linaria does, which is like CSS variables. Everything turns to be a CSS variable, and then they inline it. I think it's very elegant, and having typed CSS with zero runtime cost, I think it's the kind of like the north that we should push forward as much as we can. So, but I didn't make that by my own. I mean, I might like type the code by my own, but I get a lot of help from the community. One is Javi, that the friend I mentioned before, that explained to me like all the PBXs Google, all the CAML parse tree, migrate parse tree, like all these beauties of the compiler, and not so beauties of the compiler. Astrada, that created the OCaml CSS parser, which we abstracted in repo, and I contributed. So I can say that I created my first CSS parser. Ricky for helping me minimizing the JavaScript bundle. We can get deep into that later if you want, but that was funny. Eduardo that helped me on the PBX testing. I think he's a beast, and in a matter of hours he helped me insane. And Rusty that tried to put the Stylet PBX in production. I don't know if the pull request landed yet or not, but Reps tried to use Stylet PBXs in production. So thanks for them. And yeah, that's mostly everything I want to say. Thanks for listening. And if you have any question or doubt, you can chat me on Twitter or in Discord to have a real life conversation.
Thank you, Dave.
Thank you.
We have a couple of questions here in the chat.
Sure.
I have two that looks kind of the same to me. So one question, would it be possible to change the PBX backend so I might be able to use this on native or not include emotions big runtime payload? And another question was why BS emotion and not BS CSS? Could it support both?
Right, I could support both. Let me answer them separately. So why not BS CSS? It was because it was inline CSS. So I do like the emotion project, and I have contact with them, and they are pretty nice and pretty open. And I think the API was more stable. The bindings to emotion were a little bit better on that area, and I prefer the CSS in JS, kind of like the ones that attach the styles in your head and matches the declarations, rather than have it as inline on the top. And the other question was like, could I port this backend to native or not? Right now, I'm very limited on the sense of I do run on top of BS emotion, which I'm planning to not do, to have the possibility to create an API to match any sort of backend that you want into my solution. So you would have the input of a CSS and the output could be whatever. So I could support easily React Native out of the box, or even Reverie, right? So I could change the backend as I want to. It's like a super long idea, but it's definitely doable. So yeah.
Okay, cool. We also have a question about the inline CSS when using the CSS PBX. Is it compiled type safe?
Yeah, it is. So the same way as I transform the Stylet API, the CSS API is the same.
Okay, cool. I think that's every question for now, unless someone has another question.
I have a question. How was your experience building the PBX?
I think was one of the best experience I ever got onto engineering, or at least development, but mostly because it was so frustrating to not find any sort of documentation. Like,
yeah,
like the when you arrive to a functional kind of language, you feel like kind of like two things. One is that the types are your tests, which is super false. And the other one is that the types are documentation, right? That is even horrible, right? So I found myself reading the types plus plus learning OCaml, because the syntax doesn't look like the same, and they have like all sorts of different things that I still I made the PBX work and tested, and it's fully fully working, but there are some things that I still don't understand from the OCaml AST.
Yeah.
So yeah, I would love to write more, or at least write about how to do these pointers and the transformations, because it gets you into a really powerful state of thinking that you can support any complex structure. For sure.
Awesome.
I actually missed the question, so I have one more question.
Sure.
So it starts off like this. Doesn't your solution assume that BS emotion is a superset of the CSS string supported by Stylet components? Is this true? Have you run into a situation where the CSS strings that the PBX cannot handle?
Right. So is a superset. BS emotion is a superset of CSS. That's true. So BS emotion has like all the type safety of all the properties, but at the end you see that when there's like a property that cannot be handled, they run like an unsafe transform to string, kind of object magic, but they don't use object magic. So they do have like it is a superset of CSS, because you got like the overstates, the nesting. So at least that's my opinion. I think it's true. And did I run into a situation where CSS strings that the PBX cannot handle? Not for now. I think everything is possible. So if a person can write the bindings in a logical way, my PBX can logically create the same. I don't find anything super crazy, and I could even run this and save at the end if I wanted to. So I don't see like my PBX will have any limitation on terms of CSS strings. Right.
Okay, cool.
I think I answered all your questions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hopefully.
I think so.
Cool. Thank you for organizing all of this. That was very fun.
Yeah, thank you for speaking.
Thank you
You're the star here,
This
not us.
was really great.